us today to address these questions and more. Welcome, and thank you for joining this critical conversation.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this critical conversation hosted by the Commonwealth Foundation. It's lovely to see you all joining. Thanks you for sharing your names and where you come from. It's lovely to see the range of countries that we have participating in this really important conversation today. Today, we're going to talk about climate reparations, obstacles and opportunities for the Commonwealth small island states. We're going to focus in very much, as I see many of you are interested in, on this core issue of climate justice. I'm very pleased to welcome you today. My name is Dr. Tara Shine. I'm an environmental scientist by training, and I spent about 25 years working on the international stage on climate justice and sustainable development. I've been working as part of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change since 2003, way back in the dark ages. And I have worked right around the world from West Africa to Asia and Latin America, looking at issues of climate and environment policy and how they and how they're shaping our futures. Loss and damage is a critical issue of climate justice. It's something that really puts in stark relief the challenges we face. For too long, the world has been meeting in annual meetings of the COP, the Conference of the Parties, to try and progress our collective efforts, namely first towards mitigation, to absolutely reduce the amount of emissions we put into the atmosphere, those emissions that cause climate change, but also to adapt to the impacts of the warming that is already inevitable from the carbon pollution we have created to date. And over the years, we've been trying to make more space for a conversation on loss and damage within those international negotiations. I know that in the beginning, it was almost a taboo subject. The very thought of compensation caused absolute terror and fear, I would say, among some of the developed country parties, while it was clear from the parties of the Global South that there was a real need to start to think about unavoidable losses and damages due to extreme weather events, but also due to slow onset changes in our climate that were beyond the limits of adaptation. I'm also really proud to be chair of the board of the International Institute of Environment Development, where we're also doing a lot of work to bring those stories and narratives and lived experience of loss and damage into the climate negotiations and into the international discourse to try and break down some of the barriers and preconceptions around what loss and damage is, and to bring the realities, your realities from small island states, from least developed countries to the political arena. So it's clear that as some of the countries most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, both those extreme events and slow onset events like sea level rise and the loss of coral reefs, for example, that SIDS are at the front line of this issue. And frustrated, I mean, very frustrated by the slow pace of progress. You have amazing diplomats representing you in fora like the Human Rights Council and the UNFCCC, but how they are not frustrated and shouting from the rooftops, sometimes I don't know. We also see that there have been many broken promises in the UNFCCC, and those broken promises, both in terms of mitigation commitments and commitments to provide climate finance, erode trust within the system and make it more difficult for us to come together in solidarity and find shared solutions to the challenges of climate change, including when things are at their absolute worst, which is the point we get to with loss and damage. That loss of trust, that breakdown in trust, creates uncertainty about the power and the influence of the multilateral system to be able to come up with answers. For me, I think we absolutely must continue to have a multilateral space in which to find collective solutions to our collective problem, and to make sure that small countries like mine and small island states like yours have a voice at the table and are legally protected by the international system as these issues take hold. So what we're going to do today with our esteemed panelists and with some video contributions which we will be welcoming is to very much delve into what is loss and damage, how it's being experienced, what does this mean for small island states, how can you collectively work together to find answers and to be supported by the international community in the face of these disasters. We're going to look at everything from the role of climate finance and debt for nature swaps to the role of reparations and what that means, all the types of compensation that could be forthcoming. We're going to look at the role of human rights and the rule of the law and the role of science in helping to inform that. I now want to welcome our very first panelists, our panelists to the table. I'm going to call on all three of them. So we're going to have Dr. Payam Akavan joining us. Please unmute and show us your video. You're very welcome, Payam. We're going to hear more about you and your role in a moment. We're also going to welcome, please, Dr. James Fletcher. James, you're very welcome today. Lovely to see your face. And also Sabra Nordeen. Sabra, you're also welcome. Colleagues, you will have seen the full bios of our esteemed colleagues on the website, on the event listing for this event. So rather than rehearse their fine credentials, what we're going to do is instead hear from them and hear their wise words. This is where we really want to get started. Our first theme, we're going to split our conversation into some sections today. And our first theme is really to pick up where I was talking about, which was around, well, what role do things like these international conferences of the party play in progressing the agenda on loss and damage? We're going to look at lessons learned from previous COPs, and perhaps starting with COP26, which is quite a significant COP in the context of a slow-moving into multilateral process, was quite a significant COP in terms of progress on loss and damage. And I'm going to invite our panelists just to share some thoughts on what progress was made there, and perhaps to put that in the context of previous COPs and how long it's taken us to get to where we are today. So I'm going to start off with you, Sabra, if I may. And just to say to you, so what were your reflections if we think back to the end of COP26 in Glasgow, the agreements we got there, and how you felt progress had or hadn't been made on the issue of loss and damage? You're very welcome.
Hello, thank you. On the issue of COP, well, it took me a while to get over COP, I think, as it did for a lot of people. We went there with the expectation that it would be a lot more ambitious than the final outcome was. But I do acknowledge how difficult it is to get everyone to agree on every single word of the final outcome document. On loss and damage, what I would say is that it takes a long, long time and effort for loss and damage to be acknowledged at even this level, or that the momentum on loss and damage at the public sessions is often quite, it's not reflected in the negotiation rooms. But I do think that's changing, that there's less space now to brush it away as easily as it used to be. And part of that is due to, unfortunately, how dire the issue of loss and damage has become with the increase in climate crisis related events. And also because of the power of civil society combined with the persistence of some of the most vulnerable countries in the global south, such as small island developing states. I'd like to highlight the role played by SIDS in 2015 to anchor loss and damage as a dedicated and a separate article in the Paris Agreement, and also the legal commission that was launched at COP 26. And in response to calls for greater attention and financing on loss and damage, there has been a tendency to pivot towards mitigation and adaptation and building resilience. However, even with adaptation, we haven't seen the realization of assistance, specifically financial assistance that was pledged. So we've got a situation where, due to lack of resources and an intensification of the climate crisis, we're running behind on adaptation, reaching limits on adaptation, and seeing more loss and damage. I mean, in COP, 26, we were able to, bring about additional clarity on the Santiago network, and we hope to see its full operationalization at Egypt. And that is an achievement. But I mean, we will just continue to advocate for a standalone loss and damage facility, and also timely implementation and support. And I was really glad to see that made very clear by AOSIS in the final plenary.
Thank you, Sabra. I'm forgetting to mute myself, although after 2 years, I don't know how I still am doing that. Yeah, thanks for your observations. Yes, COPs are always hard to recover from, and we always go into them with such high hopes and never quite achieve all that we want. But thank you for bringing up the Santiago network, which we'll come back to, I'm sure, but also the Commission. So perhaps, Dr. Payam, I could come over to you to hear a little bit more about the Commission. Perhaps you could fit us in on what was announced at COP and what the role is of the new Commission in relation to loss and damage.
Thank you very much, Tara, and greetings to all the friends and colleagues who are joining this event today. You referred to the vague commitments and empty promises over the years, and we have to remember that when AOSIS was established around 1990 through the leadership of the Maldives, the issue of loss and damages was really one of the central motivating factors. And the fact that still 26 years after the Framework Convention, we have these vague commitments and empty promises prompted the prime ministers of Antigua and Barbuda and Tuvalu to conclude an agreement on the establishment of a commission of small island states on climate change and international law. And this is intended to be a vehicle for collective legal action by small island states to add yet another instrument in the toolbox that small island states have to ensure that this issue is taken seriously. The agreement, of course, is open to all AOSIS members. So in that sense, it is a bilateral agreement that matures into a multilateral agreement. On November 4th, the President of the Republic of Palau became the first state to accede to the agreement. And there is hope that yet other AOSIS members will join, so the ranks of the Commission will swell. I will maybe just briefly outline the mandate of the Commission is to contribute to the progressive development and enforcement of international law in respect of climate change. And one of the things that we teach our students at university in their first year of international law is the principle of due diligence, that a state must not cause harm to other states, must not allow its territory to be used to cause harm to other states. We also have the polluter pays principle. If you pollute, you pay. So the question is, if these principles have been applied for many decades in international law in respect, let's say, of noxious fumes from a factory chimney going across the border and harming the environment of a neighboring country, why are they not being applied in the context of greenhouse gas emissions? And in that respect, the small island states are the canary in the coal mine of catastrophic climate change. And it's remarkable that they are taking the leadership now to speak truth to power by invoking the power of legitimacy that comes from international law.
I keep forgetting to unmute myself. As an environmental scientist that has worked over the years a lot with lawyers, particularly specialists in international law, I have huge respect for those institutions in terms of the protections they can provide the most vulnerable people and communities, but also the power they have to help us implement the basis of science. So thank you so much, and we'll come back again to the Commission in the next session as well. Dr. Fletcher, I wanted to turn to you. I wondered what you thought in terms of reflections on the barriers to addressing loss and damage. Why is it such a difficult political issue? And are there some of those barriers that you believe we've started to overcome?
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. The loss and damage issue has been one that really has, I think, the first record of when EOSIS started agitating for a mechanism to deal with loss and damage goes way back to 1991, just soon after the formation of EOSIS, when they wanted a mechanism that would allow them to deal with some level of compensation for sea level rise. And it's been a really hard fought battle for the last 30 years. I remember being in Warsaw when we established the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage. And there was a very brief period that COP went overtime into Saturday. There was a very Saturday evening, and there was a very brief period where we were very worried about the whole loss and damage subject getting taken off the UNFCCC agenda completely. So the formation of the WIM, the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage, we felt was really a step in the right direction and foretold finally some significant institutional progress on loss and damage. And unfortunately, I can't say that we've seen that. We had a very big win with getting loss and damage considered as a separate article in the Paris Agreement, Article 8 in the Paris Agreement, which was a big success for small island developing states, because if you follow the negotiations leading up to Paris, there was very strong opposition from the global north, from the developed countries, from the United States, from the UK, from the rest of the EU, from Australia, for any inclusion of loss and damage as a separate element. They always felt that loss and damage was just really another element of adaptation. And we were very insistent that no, loss and damage was beyond adaptation. Loss and damage referred to these irreversible impacts of climate change to which you could not adapt. You couldn't adapt to sea level rise that has taken over miles of your coastline, ocean acidification that has caused you to lose your marine environment, which is so important for fisheries and for tourism. So these things were beyond adaptation. But even in getting loss and damage as a separate article in the Paris Agreement, the accompanying COP decision made very clear that there was no relation with that to liability and compensation. I think, and that has been the sticking point for the developed countries from day one. They do not want to accept any responsibility for loss and damage, and they certainly do not want to be considered liable for paying any compensation to the countries that are most affected by loss and damage. And I think that's really the big political issue there. It's a fear of the payout that will have to come. But for us small island developing states, the question is, if we are the recipients or the victims of this problem, as Pam quite rightly pointed out, if we are the canaries in the coal mine, you know, they use all these metaphors to describe us. We're the canaries in the coal mine. We are ground zero of the fight against climate change, yet we're not treated that way. We always have to be the ones accepting the compromise. We always have to be the ones to say, okay, you know what, just to keep loss and damage in active discussion, we are willing to do this and we're willing to do that. And I think that's why this move by the prime ministers of Antigua and Barbuda and Tuvalu was really important, because you know, we've been depending on the multilateral process and on the COP negotiations for a long time, and we've faithfully adhered to everything that has come out of there. But it's clear that that is not sufficient for us to advance this discussion. Whilst these discussions are taking place and there are all these negotiations about wording, there are countries that are losing coastline. There are people who are losing their livelihoods. There are ecosystems that are disappearing. You know, there's significant biodiversity that's being lost. So in addition to the economic impacts of loss and damage, you also have the non-economic losses that we're encountering. And I think the political temperature needs to be increased. And it is something that small island developing states have been at the forefront of. But we need to see, I think, not just other climate vulnerable countries, but the rest of the world to understand just how dire a situation these countries are facing. When Grenada loses over 200% of its GDP by the passage of Hurricane Ivan, or Dominique in the space of 3 years with Tropical Storm Erica and Hurricane Maria loses 90% and then 226% of its GDP, those are things that it takes you years, decades to recover from. So there is need for not just dialogue, not just mechanisms, but there is need for significant financial support to these countries. And I think that is what we need to get the international community to understand, and to get the politics to wrap its head around, that we can't continue talking about this just in esoteric terms. This is a life and death issue for many of the countries in small island developing states and other climate vulnerable countries.
Thank you for bringing that reality to us. And I think you're right. It's really nice. It's really helpful that you set out both the extreme economic losses that small island states are facing, but also the non-economic losses, the cultural heritage losses, biodiversity losses and those need different approaches and different types of recognition. And I think what's needed is to find some way to open up the conversation. Do you think in like 30 seconds, Sabra, the multilateral space can help to foster, it's almost like a global empathy, so that, just as Dr. Fletcher said, it shouldn't just be the small island states talking about this and caring about this. Any of us who are human beings should care about this.
Yes, I think the multilateral space can certainly foster empathy. But what follows afterwards is also crucial, which is, you know, what we need in terms of concrete technical and financial support. And I think the fact that there have been so many climate-related disasters, even in the global north recently, is bringing that closer to home for certain in the political space. And you know, Kenyan activist Elizabeth Wathuti put it really well in a podcast that everything is connected, and the more loss and damage we face in our countries, it may at some point or another impact countries in the global north as well. And if that's the way to get the message across, then I mean, it's unfortunate, but yes.
Thank you so much. Audience, I just want to invite you that you can submit your questions. Please use the Q&A function rather than the chat box if you can. So put your questions in the Q&A box. They're being moderated for us behind the scenes, and we will be able to come to them in due course. So please do send in your questions. We're going to move on to the next theme in our conversation, and to get us started, we have a pre-recorded interview from the former president of the Maldives, Mohammed Nasheed. So we're going to listen to that video now. So we will all turn off our cameras and mute so you can see the video.
It is a delight to be a part of the Commonwealth Foundation's critical conversation. We took a loan to build a road, to build a house, to build a school, to build a harbor, or some such infrastructure. When we took the debt, we took it with the received wisdom that the weather has no link to carbon emission. But now, IPCC is clearly saying that the bad weather is because of carbon emission. This bad weather has washed away the road, has taken away the house, has taken away the school, has destroyed the harbor that we built with the loan. The assets that we created are becoming stranded. Our analysis shown that for every $10 climate vulnerable developing countries spend on interest payments of the debts we took, we have to pay another dollar because of climate impacts. This is injustice piled on injustice, and adds to the moral and economic case for urgent debt relief. If there is no Maldives, we can hardly pay the debt back. Therefore, the CVF is proposing a large-scale climate debt swap for debt-distressed vulnerable countries. Here's the basic outline. Countries would first undergo a debt sustainability analysis that assesses their ability to continue to service commercial and official debt. A bank, the World Bank, or a bank, would then supervise a substantial write-down of unpayable debt and the issuance of new guaranteed bonds. This way, creditors and bondholders will get some repayment rather than seeing defaults. with at least 18 months of interest payments on these new bonds guaranteed by the bank, the World Bank, debtor countries will not be locked out of capital markets. Governments will still be able to invest in strategic areas of development, including health, education, sustainable energy, and climate resilient infrastructure. Governments are not willing to singularly announce their need for restructuring. Collectively, we must find solutions and ways of sustaining our economies. To map out the actions they will take, debtor governments within the climate vulnerable group would carry out climate prosperity plans. Bangladesh has come out with one such plan, the Mujib Prosperity Plan. For adaptation, I believe the natural climate solutions and soft engineering projects, like the protection of forests, mangroves, and coral reefs, instead of concrete seawalls and embankments, are the best approaches. Soft and biological adaptation measures. Let me be clear. We are not asking to repeat the fossil-intensive path of rich countries. There are now better options. Technologies like renewables, energy storage, clean hydrogen, and advanced nuclear fission meant that we can rapidly escape from the age of fossil fuels. But this can only happen so long as the money is available in the required investments. Historic injustices can never be righted. We cannot right the wrongs of previous generations, but we can protect the planet for generations to come. Thank you.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to speak to you today and share views of the people of Tuvalu on the importance of the Commission and the ultimate goal that need to be achieved. The Commission was established by Tuvalu and Antigua and Barbuda at COP26 because we feel that there is a need to step up our approach and to set up a platform for small island states to channel their grievances on the impacts of climate change to legal bodies to determine claims from Tuvalu and all small island states of the world. It provides a platform for small island states to seek advisory opinions directly and from the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, or ITLOS, on matters such as loss and damages, compensation, sea level rise, coastal erosion, and so forth. With the establishment of the Commission, the path to ITLOS is now open without political obstruction, giving small island states an important opportunity to move forward with the hope to avoid further debate, but focus more on actions. Furthermore, the establishment of the Commission would hopefully provide means for holding major polluters accountable in the long term and changing the scope of negotiations at future meetings of COP. There is an obligation of due diligence not to cause harm to others and to pay compensation where harm is caused by negligence and willful disregard for the rights of other nations. Why shouldn't this principle apply to greenhouse gas emissions that are destroying our small island states? With the support of reputable foundations, the Commission will become a valuable resource of legal expertise provided to small island states. My hope is that by enlisting their knowledge and experience, it will be possible to help develop and enforce international norms through legal action, and to pressure major polluters over the coming years to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions and to address the issue of loss and damages. This is now a matter of survival for small island states. Thank you all, and I wish you all the best. Paftai Lasi, Tuvalu Motetu.
Inspiring words there for us from Mohammed Nasheed in the Maldives. And secondly, there we heard from the Prime Minister of Tuvalu, the Honourable Kausea Natanu, who spoke also to the commission that Payama had introduced us to earlier and set out why for him at a political level this is an important step forward. Also very interesting to hear from Mohammed Nasheed about his views on debt, on debt cancellation for vulnerable states, and on the role of climate swaps in finding solutions to high levels of debt, in addition to extreme weather events and the impacts that they have. So lots and lots of food for thought there. I'm going to turn to our panelists first, and then I will come to you, to the audience, and to some of your questions as well. So I'm just wondering, I'm looking for reflections, perhaps starting with you, Payam, in terms of, the opportunities that were put forward by the two speakers in the video around the role of debt cancellation, around the role of stronger collective legal representation. Just your reflections would be very welcome, please.
Well, it's a basic principle, once again, of international law that where a state injures another state, it has responsibility to pay reparations, including financial compensation. So once again, the question is, why is there this persistent avoidance of this blindingly obvious truth that if the major polluters are not going to significantly mitigate their greenhouse gas emissions, where there is no shadow of doubt what the consequences are going to be, in particular for small island states, then at the very least, they must pay compensation. And the Prime Minister of Tuvalu mentioned the notion of an advisory opinion. It's one thing to develop norms of international law. It's another thing to enforce them. And of course, one of the problems with global warming is that there is not a single culprit. It's not just a dispute between two states, let's say one state dumping toxic waste in the waters of another state. So there is a diffuse responsibility, but which can still be concentrated in the major polluters. So one of the instruments that's available to small island states is seeking advisory opinions from international courts and tribunals, which are authoritative pronouncements of the law, which can be used variously for future COP negotiations or for contentious proceedings and enforcement against specific states, should that become necessary. And I just wanted to mention briefly, Tara, that it's important to note that in September of 2021, just before COP26, Vanuatu announced its initiative to request an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice, which requires a majority vote of the UN General Assembly, because that is the procedure envisaged under Article 96 of the UN Charter. And all small island states should certainly support Vanuatu's initiative. But on the other hand, the Prime Minister mentioned ITLOS, the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, established under the UN Convention for the Law of the Sea. And we know, of course, the central importance of the oceans as sinks for carbon, and in particular, their significance for small island states. And one of the significant aspects of the Commission is that it is empowered to directly seek advisory opinions from ITLOS without having to go through the General Assembly, where one can anticipate significant resistance from the major polluters. So international law is an equalizer. It's a way for small island states to balance the scales in their favor. And whether it's through the initiative to go before the ICJ, which depends on the General Assembly, or the initiative to go before ITLOS, small island states have to exploit whichever procedures are available to them in order to move loss and damages from this sort of evasive tactics to a period where we can really begin to enforce and spell out to the major polluters what their obligations are.
Thank you, Payam, for those reflections and for spelling out a bit more the different way that the commissions and international law can be used, as you say, as an equalizer for small island states, but also how these advisory opinions can help to move the legal system forward. Dr. Fletcher, I wonder if I could turn to you for your reflections on Mohammed Nasheed's suggestions to us around the role of debt cancellation and debt for climate swaps. What are your expectations of this type of an approach? Is this something which is something we can move into practice?
It certainly is important because I can speak for the Caribbean, for example. Many of our countries in the Caribbean have a very limited fiscal space because of heavy borrowing that has taken place. And a lot of that borrowing has been associated with having to borrow funds to recover from extreme weather events, to recover from hurricanes, flooding, heavy winds that have impacted many of our economic sectors, tourism, agriculture, impacted public infrastructure. So, we found ourselves in a situation where our debt burden has increased, and our debt burden has increased because of climate change. Many of our countries are in what you call a continuous cycle of repair and recovery. No sooner have we recovered from one extreme weather event and we hit by another one. And it doesn't have to be a hurricane. It doesn't have to be something that makes international headlines. We're going through more extreme droughts and more prolonged droughts that are having serious impacts on our agricultural sectors. So clearly there is a need to look at debt. The problem, however, is that the debt burden of small island developing states is not homogeneous. It's not the same across all the small island developing states. So if you look at a country like mine, St. Lucia, and many of the other countries in the Caribbean, a lot of the debt we carry is not debt from multilateral institutions like the World Bank or the IMF, which can very easily be put into that sort of debt for climate swap. But a lot of it is private debt that is owed to banks, debt that is as a result of bonds that have been floated on the regional government securities exchange. So it's difficult to enter into a debt for climate swap with private debt. I think that's something that when we look at those debt for climate, debt for environment regimes, we have to understand that the debt is not the same everywhere. But I absolutely agree that it is something that has to be looked at. And I think it speaks to a very important moral issue in this whole discussion, that countries in the global south, small island developing states and other climate vulnerable countries are being forced to borrow money to respond to a problem that they did not cause. In fact, to respond to a problem of which they are the victims. And I think that's unconscionable. And that's why whenever we speak of funding for adaptation, and most certainly when we hope that funding for loss and damage comes through, it can't be loans that these countries will go and borrow money at market rates to really deal with a problem that they did not cause. A significant portion of those funds have to be in the form of grants, because that is the only way we can see a real compensatory mechanism being put in place that would allow there to be some level of climate justice. The other thing I think that's very important that is helping in this is the fine-tuning of attribution science that is allowing us now to really determine how much of the impact of an extreme weather event is caused by climate change. I think that's been one of the problems that we've had. People will say, well, you've always had hurricanes. You live in the Atlantic. There've always been this Atlantic hurricane season. But many of our hurricanes now are becoming more intense in a shorter period of time. Hurricanes are going from category 1 to category 5 in the space of 24 hours. We were not seeing that before. And that is something that the model suggested, that we will see more extreme weather events, more extreme hurricanes. And I think attribution science will now allow us to say that, okay, this hurricane that impacted Tuvalu or impacted St. Lucia, 75% of the damage was as a result of climate change, as a result of global warming. So the more we can fine tune the science with this, I think the better we can make a case. But the problem is we don't have time. Our countries are continuously being ravaged and our debt burden is increasing. So yes, the whole issue of of debt for climate swaps is important, but I think even more important is for us to look at how do we cause these countries to get access to finance now, grant financing, so that they don't have to go borrowing more money to respond to issues which they are doing almost on a daily basis in all of these climate vulnerable countries.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fletcher. Yeah, I think I could explain even to a small child the unfairness of the situation, to have to borrow money and get into debt to solve a problem you didn't create. I mean, it's always the injustice of this situation is so clear and evident that even small children can understand, yet the search for just and fair solutions is significantly more complex. I think it's also useful to think about that whole range of possible responses, from grants to debt cancellation to reparations and compensation. I imagine it's a range of things that are needed. Sabra, I wondered if you just wanted to pick up on these ideas around the Commission and also on the financing of loss and damage, just to add your perspectives to those of Payam and Dr. James Fletcher.
Thank you. I think actually Dr. Fletcher and Payam really painted a very accurate picture of what we're facing. And former President Nasheed always manages to get the message across very clearly. And he's absolutely right. High levels of debt really severely limit a state's ability to meet its priorities. And in addition to the impacts of COVID, plus also dealing with immediate development needs, trying to deal with increasing aspects of climate change with a very limited fiscal space just makes everything a lot more challenging. We have to constantly reprioritize the resources we have to areas that are more important than others for that day. And we already spend a significant amount of our own budget on a lot of adaptation measures. But there's only so many times we can replenish sandbags on the shore or reclaim islands higher. To address issues like slow onset events, like climate crisis and how it affects our fish stocks, which isn't always, something which is rarely something that you can counter with an adaptation measure. That's something that we need longer term financing for. And Dr. Fletcher is absolutely correct that the issue is access to finance and support. We just don't have that. There's so many bureaucratic hurdles that it's impossible to first try and prove that this is a climate change related project that you're trying to access financing for. In terms of the Loss and Damage Commission, I think it's a really bold and very commendable step taken by Tuvalu, Antigua, and Barbuda towards establishing climate justice. And it was something that was received very excitedly in the Maldives. Often it's difficult to balance the kind of bleakness of the science, but this helps to bring about a little bit more fight as well. So it was welcomed in the Maldives. And it just shows that we can't afford further delays within the UNFCCC system.
Thank you, Sabra. Yeah, really important reflections. And I'm just wondering then, Payam Akvan, if I could go back to you for a second. So Dr. Fletcher spoke about, attribution science and how much that has moved on. I remember for years being so careful about how I would talk about any particular extreme weather event and not overstating its connection to climate change. And we no longer need to do that. We have very clear science very soon after events that are clearly able to attribute it to human-induced climate change. So I wonder how that attribution helps and supports the case for legal liability. And I wonder if you could give us maybe an example, a live one or a recent one, of where, for example, a small island state may be able to take another state to court, if you like, or create a case, and what the role of the Commission might be, in that context of an example.
Yes, thank you, Tara. And first, I wanted to just briefly thank Ambassador Noordine for her remarks and for the tremendous leadership role that the Maldives has played among small island states on this issue. So her words are very reassuring. And I'm also very pleased that Dr. Fletcher mentioned attribution science. That would have been my next point, that although the harm is of a diffuse nature, it's not the same as noxious fumes going from a factory chimney from one state across the boundary into another state. But he is very correct and knows this far better than I, that there have been significant advances made in trying to localize and define the sources of harm. And it's not necessary to have 100% accuracy in order to attribute liability. So I think that this is a question of strategy for the members of the Commission. The Commission is open to all small island states, and it will be those members who will decide how to use these instruments. But obviously, an advisory opinion has the advantage of setting a framework, which thus far does not really exist with clarity, at least in interstate proceedings. We now have a number of human rights complaints before the European Court of Human Rights, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, which are individual complaints. But at the level of interstate relations, an advisory opinion would at least set the framework, which, among other things, can then be used for contentious litigation against specific states, against specific polluters. And we have to realize that in the coming years, this issue, unfortunately, is only going to deteriorate. So it's that much more important to be looking not just at the horizon of the next 3 or 6 months or what we will do at COP27, but how will small island states protect their interests in the coming decade, in the coming years. So it's in that regard that we need to have a bigger vision of how this can become a vehicle for collective legal action. And I must say it will be very difficult for the major polluters indefinitely to ignore legal action. It will create significant difficulties and tilt the balance in favor of small island states.
Thank you so much. We're going to go now to some questions to make sure that others get a chance to contribute to our conversation as well. So we have a pre-recorded question that we'd like to play to you from Josiah Jerouani from Papua New Guinea. So I'm going to ask my colleagues, please, just to turn your videos off again. I will do the same, and mute yourselves, and we will hear the question from Josiah. Thank you.
With the recent pledges under the Glasgow Climate Pact reaffirming 100 billion per year with additional funds of US 600 million to LDCs and US 350 million adaptation fund, I am afraid that most of these funds will not reach those most in need, since from our experience, most of these climate finance funds are injected into multilateral institutions, which has a lot of complex requirements in order to access the funding. My question to our esteemed panelists is, what needs to be done to ensure that countries or communities and local NGOs have ease of access to these funds? And secondly, what needs to be done to ensure a localized or decolonized approach on the funding mechanisms or modality for climate finance, so that it assists those who need it the most and they are able to access it to enable adaptive action and resilience in our communities or respond to the devastating levels of loss and damage that we are facing. Thank you so much.
Thank you to Josiah for his questions and that reflection. You can hear his frustration in how is it that these huge sums of money we hear about mobilized at the international level, how will they reach his community? And his question was really around what needs to be done to ensure that NGOs have access to these funds, that they don't just get tied up in the multilateral system, but also how do we ensure that these funds reach the local level where the needs are greatest? Panelists, you might just signal to me, raise a finger if you'd like to come in on that question. Sabra, you have the floor. You're very welcome.
Thank you. It's a great question, and it's actually something that we've been talking about for years, which is how difficult it is to access financing. And a lot of it has to do with how bureaucratic and how complex the reporting mechanisms are, and how long and drawn out a process it is. For example, some of the GCF projects that the Maldives has received, it's taken years to get from the application process to actually realizing the project. And by the time we actually, are able to start implementation, things on the ground have changed. And that's not necessarily just political needs or a community's needs, but also the impact of the climate change itself. I mean, for us, we would like to see more finance directed towards actual projects and work on the ground rather than just technical consultations and reporting. I mean, we were quite aware of what needs to be done in our own states, in our own countries. And it's frustrating to not be able to first have pledges, then not be realized, but also not be able to easily access the financing that is there.
Thank you, Ambassador. Really, really useful reflections. We've got another question here, which I'm going to read out, and then Dr. Fletcher and Payam, you might want to come in on either of them. Leon Charles, hi Leon, how are you doing from Grenada? A one-off contribution to a fund will not be sufficient, as these losses and damages will be recurring over time. How can we determine who will contribute to funding, how the extent of the contribution will be determined, and how the payments will be collected and enforced? Are there any models in place right now that can provide a basis for starting work on these challenges? A detailed question there, but yeah, how do we determine the amounts? How do we make sure that there is oversight and enforcement for them getting to where they need to, being collected and then to getting where they're needed? And are there any models that you've come across that might help us to do that? Dr. Fletcher, I might go to you first on that one, and also if you want to pick up anything from the Josiah's question as well.
It's an excellent question from Leon, and I'm not surprised. I mean, Leon is one of our Caribbean experts in the climate change space and one of our long-standing negotiators. I think we have to look at, he's correct, how do we capitalize a loss and damage fund? And one of the areas I've always said needs to be investigated is this whole question of carbon taxation and how do we, we have many carbon taxation, carbon tax regimes going on, and we also have them being done by individual firms. I remember, for example, anytime I flew on British Airways, there would always be this thing that would ask you whether you wanted to offset your emissions as a result of your flying from St. Lucia to the UK and making a contribution. I always found it a little ironic because my country was the one being impacted by climate change, yet I was being asked to make a contribution to offset the damage. But even more important for me was, where was this money going? This money was going to British Airways, that British Airways would use for something that it deemed relevant in the fight against climate change. I think those money should go into a loss and damage fund. I think whatever money is collected from the major contributors to greenhouse gas emissions, be it in the shipping industry, in the international aviation industry, and certainly on the ground with the major polluters, the major industrial firms, I think that money for the form of some form of carbon tax should go into a loss and damage fund so that there can be a direct contribution to these countries. It should not go into a fund that is managed in the domestic jurisdiction of that country. It should go into the loss and damage fund because these emissions are what are causing global warming, which is what is contributing, or which is what is causing the irreversible impacts of climate change that we're experiencing in climate vulnerable countries. Now, I know it's a radical configuration, but really we are dealing with existential threats to these small island developing states and other climate vulnerable countries. And I think we have to look past what has worked in the past and the barriers to implementing and understanding that it is life and death. If you do not do that, then the Maldives will disappear. Kiribati will disappear. Fiji will disappear. There are countries in the Bahamas that will disappear. Many areas, many parts of the coastline of many of our Caribbean countries, although mountainous, will cease to exist. So I think we have to look at some sort of international carbon taxation mechanism that would put money directly into a loss and damage fund and hopefully the requirements for accessing those funds would not be as onerous as they are right now with the GCF. I understand the need for proper accounting. I understand the need for ensuring that the problem you're trying to solve is one that is caused by climate change and not one that is, part of the developmental agenda of the country. But we have to make it easier for these countries to access that money and to access those funds more quickly, which is not the case, as Ambassador said. By the time you get the money, the problem that you're trying to solve has been amplified 15 or 20 times. So the funds you've been able to mobilize are insignificant compared to what it is that you requested.
Thank you, Dr. Fletcher. Yeah, I actually think the notion of ring fencing carbon funds is almost less controversial than the decision would have to be taken about how that fund would be then managed and governed to ensure that the access was much more effective and fair than our current systems. I think that's something that's really, really fascinating to think about some more. I have some more questions, 2 questions, so I'm going to read those out. One is from Marina Young in Malaysia. Nice to hear from you, Marina. Could compensation be proportionately paid by each country based on total historic CO2 emissions to date? So it's a similar thing, I think, similar to the carbon tax idea. So could compensation be proportionally paid by each country based on their historical emissions to date? This would allow for historical polluters and current polluters to shoulder the responsibility fairly, thus enlarging the concept of shared responsibility and shared prosperity. So that's one question to ponder. And I'm just going to read the second one as well. And the second is from Sharif Nora Said Ibrahim from Indonesia. If military transgressions can be awarded reparations, the SIDS victims of climate change should also be provided with similar reparations for damages to persons, properties, and ecosystems. How can we quantify that damage? What if an island nation becomes submerged forever or it becomes inhabitable, just as we were speaking about? What would be the result? What would be the level of reparation required, therefore, for a loss of territory, a loss of sovereignty, essentially? Payam, maybe you'd like to pick up on some of those. All very, very, very big questions, but it would be great to have your reflections.
No, those are very good questions for which there is no easy answer. How do you provide reparation to Tuvalu, Kiribati, Marshall Islands, Maldives that may disappear in the foreseeable future? And I think we need to consider 2 aspects of the reparation issue. One is what Dr. Fletcher said. We have a global problem, but we don't have the global institutions to address them. It's really blindingly obvious, but the political will is not there to look beyond myopic self-interest to engage in planetary politics. And that's why I think it's so remarkable what the prime ministers of Antigua and Barbuda and Tuvalu and Palau and others have done. They're engaging in effect in planetary politics, because the question of compensation isn't just about how much money goes into the pockets of these governments or their citizens, but it's also about deterrence. Deterrence. We have to exact a cost so that major polluters radically change their behavior. And I think we would all agree that the best solution is prevention. Rather than simply driving over the cliff, we do have the opportunity to choose a different path, and perhaps legal action will be a way of exacting a cost, making the polluter pay so that major polluters perhaps can change course.
Thank you very much. Any of our other panelists want to come in and just complement that? We've got another couple of minutes before we move on to the next theme. Just unmute if you wish to speak.
Yes, sorry. The question is, could a sort of proportional compensation mechanism be developed? The answer is yes. Would a proportional compensation mechanism be developed? The answer is probably no, because that's the fight we've been having. That's, I can tell you about some of the sidebars, some of the bilaterals that I had leading my and also leading the Caribbean's delegation to the negotiations for the Paris Agreement. And that was the pushback from the developed countries, that they do not want to be held responsible for historical emissions or for the problem that got us there. So absolutely, it would be a very fair way of dealing with this. But the fight to get that to happen is a monumental one. And I think it's something that they, and maybe that's what some of our governments need to do. They need to understand, our leaders need to understand that this fight for climate change is not one that should only take place within the confines of the UNFCCC and climate change. It's a fight that has to be taken into every single negotiating arena that our countries are involved in, because climate change is impacting on everything. It's impacting on trade, it's impacting on tourism, it's impacting on food security and agriculture, impacting on health, impacting on water security. So I think everywhere where we engage with the international community, this whole question of climate change and the impact that climate change is having on our countries needs to be addressed, so that maybe we can weave into these various negotiations some level of understanding and some kind of financial support for the countries whose health sector is being impacted because of climate change, because you have more heat deaths, you have more vector-borne diseases that are impacting them. Climate change is impacting health in so many different ways. So every time we engage with the WHO or the Pan American Health Organization, we should have climate change at the top of the agenda. So I think that is certainly one area that we can look at, expand this discussion and amplify it in every single negotiating arena.
Unmuting me, muting me and unmuting me. I think you've really spelled out in detail there what Payam referred to as planetary politics. And that this is not something which lives only within the bubble of the UNFCCC, because it's quite a unique little bubble, and I think breaking it out into all aspects of politics is going to be incredibly important. I'm going to move on, and thank you to the audience for the questions. I mean, there's such a high caliber of question. You're going to get another opportunity to share questions in just a moment, but I just wanted to move on to kind of the final section of our discussion, and at this stage perhaps to think about, well, how can we build this solidarity? We somehow need not just the small island states to come together in a solidarity to work together for legal recourse, as we've been talking about, but somehow we have to get others in other countries. Like me, I sit in Ireland, a developed country, part of the European Union. How do we get people in my country to have a greater sense of what's facing humanity, about the loss that we all share in, and to have a greater level of empathy and solidarity with those of you living in small island states. Dr. Fletcher, I might just go to you first. I just wondered, how can coalitions like the Alliance for Small Island States, AOSIS, the Climate Vulnerable Forum, and regional intergovernmental bodies like CARICOM and the PIF and the Commonwealth, how can they advance some of the types of solutions and innovative approaches that we've discussed here today?
I think on two levels. The first is ensuring that people understand that climate change is not an environmental issue. It may have started within the environment, but it certainly is not an environmental issue. It is a cross-cutting issue that is impacting everyone. And unfortunately, I think we viewed climate change as something that is the responsibility of the environmentalists or the Department of the Environment or the environmental agencies to find a solution to. It's not. In fact, it wasn't even caused by the environmentalists. It was caused by something that happened with industrialization in developed countries. So I think that's the first part of it, to build that broad-based coalition of everyone, of the people involved, as I intimated earlier, the people involved in tourism, in public infrastructure, in health, in agriculture, everywhere, so that they understand that climate change is impacting them. But I think even more importantly than that, there is a need to use civil society as a vehicle. I think civil society is the most important vehicle we have right now. A lot of the momentum that we're seeing in climate change is actually being driven by civil society, the civil society movements that are taking place, the attention that civil society is drawing to this, because the only things politicians listen to is whether something is going to impact their votes and affect their viability at the next general election. And civil society is the one that can impact the viability of a political party or government at the next general election. If civil society says that this is a matter that you absolutely must pay attention to, because it is unconscionable that Ireland or Sweden or the United States or Russia or China is causing a problem that is creating unlivable conditions for countries in the global south, then you need to do something about it. So we have to make climate change an issue that now becomes a political issue, and not just a political issue in the countries of the global south, but a political issue in the countries of the global north, because there are so many ramifications of this that will impact the global north. And I think that's how we do it. So one, by causing that coalition of non-environmental agencies, so everybody sees this as their problem, but even more importantly, mobilizing civil society. And I like what the young people are doing. I think young people understand, they get it. They understand that what we are doing is passing on a baton to them of a planet that is much worse than the one that we inherited from our parents. And they're saying, what am I going to do with this? And I think we have to get them to lead that fight, because they're the ones who can influence change, and they can also influence their parents, who are the ones in power right now, to make those changes.
Thank you so much. I mean, I was hopping out of my seat when you said climate change is not an environmental issue. As someone who is an environmental scientist and has worked alongside many of you on these issues for years, I think it's the biggest thing we did wrong. We lost so many years talking about this as an issue of atmospheric science and as a technical issue to be solved by climate scientists, when it is a deeply, deeply social, cultural issue in the end of the day. And I like this thought that if we could create a civil society solidarity which helped each person in the world to know that my actions are creating unlivable conditions elsewhere, but also here for me, if not now, very soon. And that whole notion of creating unlivable conditions for our own species really points out the frailty of our current system. Thank you so much for that. I'd love to go to Ambassador Sabra Noordine now for just to reflect a little further. Sabra, how can small and vulnerable states build then the solidarity and their power in the international system so that they are heard more, and that we somehow manage to get this communication across that if your actions are creating an unlivable future for me, for your children, for the children of today, how might we do that?
Well, I'm a big champion of the Commonwealth, actually, and the Maldives rejoined the Commonwealth in 2020, and one of the reasons was, primarily this, that it helps us to amplify our needs and our voices on a very large stage where we're very small or quite often not even put on a map sometimes, and the relationships that we have and the really strong, the strength of AOSIS and also organizations like CVF, which was founded in the Maldives, it really helps to create that solidarity, because although we're all going through different levels of impact, it's all derived from the same issue, and there's a lot to learn from each other as well. For instance, I mean, it was only after hearing about Tuvalu and their issues about, what happens to the issue of sovereignty, that it was something that we began to think about seriously as well. Or even issues of, the climate crisis and its impact on health. I mean, there are so many things that we don't consider on the level that needs to be considered, because it's something that we just it hasn't come on our radar. And to see that other countries and other groups in our own community are doing that same type of work, it helps to share those lessons. And that solidarity is really, really important, because AOSIS especially, and the Commonwealth, giving us this platform to really amplify our voices, it's really driven issues like adaptation and loss and damage on the global platform purely because we're able to work together.
Thank you so much. No, I'm still not unmuted. I am unmuted. Okay. Thank you, Ambassador. Yeah, I'm sitting thinking about your reflections on sovereignty. And I remember when I worked with Mary Robinson, our first female president of Ireland, And she had many interactions with presidents and prime ministers from small island developing states. And she always used to kind of sit down at the end of the day after those reflections and say, wow, in all the time I was head of state for my country, I never had to consider us losing our sovereignty, or that my island would go underwater and I would have to evacuate my entire citizenship. This was just something that seemed like it would be a crazy fairy tale or nightmare, more likely. And yet that's the reality that many of our leaders are facing today. Payam, I wonder if we might go to you and just think about, I'm wondering how civil society and small and vulnerable state leaders can work together to seek a climate justice that ensures decision making, funding, and support reaches vulnerable people and communities, those that we talk about being on the front line. So, how can we bring the civil society that we've recognized is so important together with the state leaders which come together under the Commission as part of AOSIS to give that stronger emphasis on decision making happening with those people who are on the front lines?
Well, this is a fundamental question, and I answer it not as an expert, but as the average citizen. In my human rights career, one thing I've understood is that the only lasting change comes from the grassroots, that the seismic shifts in consciousness that we need very rarely come from the top down. So it was very, very heartening at COP26 to see the thousands of people who had come to Glasgow in this show of solidarity, in this new culture of empathy. And I want to maybe just reflect briefly on a rather stark statement that Arnold Toynbee said. He said, civilizations are not murdered, they commit suicide. That is exactly what we are doing. We are committing collective suicide by not changing our way of life. So when it comes to empathy, we have to look at the gospel of greed, which has characterized consumerism. Consumerism is an addiction, which is why we find it so difficult to speak to people about radically changing their way of life, not because of some great lofty ideal, but as an act of survival and self-preservation. And I take a lot of inspiration, including here in Canada, from our Indigenous peoples who speak about, and I'm a professor of law, so we speak about natural law as a kind of philosophical or theological idea, but they speak about natural law literally as the laws of Mother Nature. And we have to understand in the arrogance of our anthropocentric view that we are just an insignificant speck in an infinite universe, and that in a contest between us and Mother Earth, we will definitely lose. The Earth will go on, but we will become extinct. So empathy is about reaching that deeper spiritual, moral consciousness, which motivates us to act selflessly and sacrificially, and nothing short of such an ethos is going to get us out of this conundrum.
Thank you, Payam. Yeah, I mean, I find it something I say so much more nowadays. The Mother Earth, she will be fine, but we will be gone. So your quote that civilizations are not murdered, they commit suicide, is very powerful in that sense. And it makes me go back to what Dr. Fletcher said. How can we make climate justice something that is for everybody? I wrote a book for people in the developed consumerist world called How to Save Your Planet One Object at a Time, because I wanted to be living more sustainably and eschewing consumerism something that everybody could do, everybody, regardless of where they lived or how well off they were or what their interests were. And I think growing that community of people who share this passion that we clearly all do is so important. I want to go to a question that we have. This is another recorded question, and then we're going to come back to questions from those of you who are online. The question we have now is from Gladys Habu from the Solomon Islands. So we're just going to turn off our videos, myself and the panelists, just briefly to hear Gladys.
Hi everyone, my name is Gladys Habu. I am a very, very passionate young Pacific climate advocate based in the Solomon Islands, and today I am so pleased to be part of this critical conversation with your esteemed panelists. Before I ask my question, just as brief context, I'll draw from the reality on the ground, which is for many of our vulnerable population, we are very disconnected to the first world. We are living day to day, hand to mouth, to survive under leadership that has been struggling for many, many years. And now, more than ever, we are entering COVID-19 community transmission for the first time since the pandemic. And so it has been very, very tough. But also noting that since COP26 has ended, it seems that the conversation has also died down from the very people who are most responsible for causing us this extra burden of hardship. I mean, how can we effectively keep the momentum going? How can we maintain focus, especially as youth from vulnerable island states? How can we show the world that we are doing our best, despite how tough it is, to lead effectively in this climate fight, but also acknowledging that youth form the majority population in many countries, especially here in the Pacific? And encourage the rest of the world to invest in the youth population, because it is honestly a direct investment into the active climate workforce that we all need for new change, the change that we all hope to see. I'd like to hear your opinion on this, because really, money alone is not the solution. We need to have engineered solutions that would engage the whole community in different ways. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Gladys. I'm trying to get my video to turn back on. Yay! Wow, that was heartfelt from Gladys in the Solomon Islands. Just to pick up on two of her questions, how can we effectively keep momentum going post COP26? I think this is a frustration for many young people and activists that follow COPs. It's all over everything for 2 weeks, and then it just feels like it disappears again till that time next year. And how can we maintain focus, especially as youth from vulnerable island states? How can we help them and support them to keep their energy, keep their momentum? Ambassador Nordine, you look like you have something you'd like to say in response.
I find this a really difficult issue because it's again sort of acknowledging the very, very vital role that the youth are now playing in advocacy and political pressure. It also feels like we're again placing the burden on that advocacy and change on the youth. And I don't think that's entirely fair, but it has been so vital. And I wish there was a better answer than this, but to keep up the pressure is really the only thing I can think of, because it has made a difference, even if it's slow and, you know, the steps are small. It does make a difference. I mean, nationally, keeping up the pressure on climate change means that we have to revisit policies, rethink what we're planning on doing, designs, you know, what we prioritize, and that scales up internationally too. And I think that kind of civil society pressure and youth pressure has made it impossible to really keep deferring this issue and not giving it the attention it deserves.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and I think it's so true. The voices are heard. I also would want to say that to youth activists, you are heard. I know that I've sat inside the negotiating rooms in COPs, and I've heard the voices outside. I've heard the reflections of that and the political pressure be expressed by leaders in the room saying, but this is, if we do this, we're not responding to the demand we hear outside these doors. So it has an impact. It definitely has. Perhaps not as fast and not as on the scale that we need, but definitely I would use that as an incentive to keep up your activism. And also I would say, please know that there are many of us that are older than you who who are here with you, who hope that we have laid some of the foundations for the actions we need to scale up in the coming years. Please don't feel like the burden is all on your shoulders.
Tara?
Yeah, please, Dr. Fletcher.
Thanks. I think the other thing that we can do is to expand the discussions on climate change outside of the UNFCCC and the COPs. I think that's a frustration that many people feel. Okay, once a year there's a COP and we hear about the COP. Well, of course, there are the meetings that go on in Bonn, the intersessional meetings that nobody hears about. But once a year we have a COP and everybody hears about the COP. The COP lasts 2 weeks, and then after the COP, what then? We now have to wait for COP27 in Egypt. What we need to do is to continue those discussions. One of the things that we found in the Caribbean very useful in the build-up to COP21 was developing a civil society coalition that involved the journalists, our artists, so our reggae singers and our calypsonians, our young people. And they're the ones who provided the momentum to us leading up to COP21. And they basically were the wind beneath our wings that carried us to Paris and made us understand that we could not come back to the Caribbean without an ambitious Paris Agreement outcome. And I think we have to do the same thing now. It's one of the things that, for example, we've started with this Caribbean Climate Justice Project, where we've been working with young people and getting young people to understand climate justice and understand what we can do at a domestic level, not just to agitate for greater action on climate change, but also to hold our old governments accountable for some of the things that they're doing that are exacerbating the impacts of climate change in our respective countries. So I think, we have to do that. We have to see how we can get little actions happening at the household and community level so people can understand, okay, how do I make this my problem? How do I make this something that I'm contributing to? So I think if we take it out of the strict confines of the UNFCCC negotiations and we cause action to happen, modest action, but action to happen in the individual countries led by civil society. And I can tell you, there is a large group of young people who are very interested in this. And the other thing, I don't want to leave without saying this, bring our young people to COP. Unfortunately, I know we're restricted by finance and we don't have the resources of the developed countries. Very often we can only bring 3 or 4 delegates, and those delegates have to be negotiators. But let's see if the private sector can help us fund 3 or 4 people from each of our countries so that they attend COP. They do the side events. They host side events of their own so that they're able to tell their story and hear from other people. So when they come back, one, they've understood what happens in the negotiations, but also they now can take this and translate it into action on the ground. Our young people need to be present at COPs, and they need to be present in everything that our governments are doing. We keep looking at young people as the future, but they're the present. And they are the present who will be inheriting the mess that we're creating. So we need to bring them to the table, and we need to get them to be part of the decision-making and part of the action to solve the problems.
Hear, hear. I couldn't agree with you more. And I would just say also that, and that influence can happen at local government level, at national level in your own country, and at the international level. Don't feel that you have to start with something like a COP. You have also got a really strong influence closer to home. There are 3 amazing questions. I'm going to read them out and we'll see if we can pay them some justice in the final few minutes. Asad Rahman from the United Kingdom asks, at COP26, rich countries such as the USA, UK and EU prevented the outcome needed on loss and damage because of their red line on the issue of liability to prevent future claims for climate damages, despite this being the main demand of developing countries and civil society. Will anything change by COP27 to make loss and damage more than just a dialogue? If so, what? I see Payam smiling. Then a second question, so maybe think about kind of 1-sentence answers to these questions, or more or less. Another question from Diamante Simcon in Jamaica. Thank you, Diamante. Reparations are central to the expansive project of building a more just world. How can loss and damage and the reparations framework be used to move the dial in rich countries away from colonial mentalities of climate finance as a gift to one that is about redistributing and reversing financial flows? Powerful question. And another from Sarifa Nora in Indonesia. On the 9th of February, judgment by the International Court of Justice on reparation for armed activities. It diffused responsibilities in climate change is problematic, but there must be a few ways we can progress. Already mentioned by the speakers are through ITLOS for special advisory, the International Court of Justice, etc. can mechanisms such as the ILC and the 6th Legal Committee of the United Nations General Assembly, or even the Security Council, be used, considering that environmental catastrophes are security risks? A few of those are quite legal questions, so Payam, you're going to give you the first shot at that, and we have about 3 minutes.
Well, very briefly, I think that we need to engage in standard setting, progressive development of norms through the work of the International Law Commission on Sea Level Rise, the questions of what happens with retreating coast, do states keep their maritime areas? And there are a number of very important issues. And then I would hope that in the coming months, small island states will unite in common cause and have recourse to international courts and tribunals, not just as a legal process, but as part of a larger civil society movement. We have to realize that it's not just about the case that comes before a court, but it's all the social movements behind that proceeding. And I would say that if we were all now in a street, in a protest chanting, our slogan should become "the polluter pays." It's as simple as that. And I hope that the efforts of the Commission with the a greater number of small island states becoming members will be able to have some impact on the discourse in the coming months and years.
Thank you. So we need new planetary politics where we make sure that the polluter pays, where we empower civil society to have the voice that it needs and to create a global solidarity with the countries on the front lines. Colleagues, so much. You've given us so much food for thought. I've learned an awful lot from listening to you all and from the very, very insightful questions that we have had throughout this session from the audience. Very sorry we did not get to answer every single one of your questions. There were so many coming in on the chat. But if you want to continue the conversation, please know that you can do so on social media. On Twitter and Instagram, the Commonwealth Foundation can be found at Commonwealth.org. You can find it there. So if you have more thoughts, if you want to continue to share with this community, please do so there. Please also know that the Commonwealth Foundation's next critical conversation will take place on the 29th of March. It's going to look at vaccine equity, distribution, the role of big pharma, and how the Commonwealth can support countries to address vaccine inequity. So that's a very, very relevant conversation. And I hope climate change comes up as part of it, because as we know, it's the same inequities and injustices that are reflected across these different global issues. For those of you that have been invited to the press Q&A, please stay on this link. We will take a 5-minute break and then we will commence that session with our panelists who are being kind enough to stay on with us until we'll begin that conversation at 3:35 p.m. That's UK time. Otherwise, I want to say thank you and a huge, huge, huge appreciation to Ambassador Sabra Nordin, Dr. Payam Akbar, and Dr. James Fletcher. You are all amazingly passionate specialists and experts. You gave us a full view of the politics, the finance, and the passion that is needed to really make significant progress on these issues of loss and damage and climate reparations. I thank you very, very much. So we're going to turn off our cameras now, say goodbye to you all, and thank you very much for participating.